Picture a single silicon wafer, roughly the size of a dinner plate, polished to a mirror finish, rolling off a production line inside a CXMT fabrication plant somewhere in central China in early 2026. That wafer is going to appear on a balance sheet. And when it does, it will help cancel out a decade of losses in roughly 90 days. How does a memory company that bled red for 10 straight years book one quarter that wipes the whole decade clean? That question has three answers. The first one is satisfying. The second one is almost right. The third one is the one that actually matters. The simplest answer is accounting. Companies approaching a major listing event sometimes take the opportunity to recognize previously deferred items, restructure provisions, or consolidate subsidiary results in ways that had not been reflected before. CXMT passed a review by the Star Board, a significant milestone on the path toward a public listing, and moments like that have historically prompted companies to reorganize how losses and gains sit on the books. A decade of accumulated red ink can look very different after a thorough accounting reorganization. Repainting a house before you sell it makes it look better. It does not add a second floor. And revenue is the second floor? My first instinct was the obvious one. Accounting tidying, one-time items, a quarter dressed up for an IPO filing. But that instinct assumed the underlying business had not actually moved. It had. Because one-time items can flatter a net profit line. They cannot guide first-half revenue up 613 to 677% over the prior year. Revenue is not a reclassification. Something was actually selling, at volume, at a price that worked. So the question sharpens. How does a memory company that bled red for 10 years book one quarter that wipes the decade clean? The second answer points to the DRAM price cycle. Memory markets move in long, violent swings. After an extended period of oversupply and compressed margins that punished every producer globally, including Micron, industry pricing began recovering. When the cycle turns, every DRAM producer's revenue lifts at roughly the same time. The cycle is real. It did lift the industry broadly in early 2026. And here is where I had to argue with myself. A DRAM price cycle is weather. It hits everyone. But a 600+% guided revenue jump on top of a cycle is not weather. That is something structural sitting underneath the weather. Imagine a rising tide that lifts every boat in the harbor, except one boat has a private channel running directly to the docks, and all the cargo trucks are contracted to unload there first. The tide is real. The channel explains the gap. Cycles are symmetric. They lift Micron, SK Hynix, Samsung, and every other producer simultaneously. A cycle alone produces correlated improvement across the whole industry. It does not explain why one firm's revenue guidance would outpace its peers by hundreds of percentage points. Something was routing demand specifically to CXMT that was not routing it to anyone else. And building that channel is what the 10 years of losses were actually doing. How does a memory company that bled red for 10 years book one quarter that wipes the decade clean? The losses were the entry fee for a protected, subsidized domestic market that, once it reached scale and demand aligned with policy, routed the revenue in one concentrated burst. Reports indicate CXMT booked roughly 24.76 billion yuan in net profit in the first quarter of 2026 alone. That figure is company disclosed, and no independent benchmark has confirmed it yet. But if it holds, it would exceed cumulative losses from the prior decade. The company's own guidance puts first-half revenue growth between 613 and 677% year-on-year. Those numbers do not come from accounting adjustments. They do not come from a global cycle. They come from Chinese enterprises, many with government procurement ties or policy incentives, buying domestic DRAM at scale and CXMT being the only domestic supplier operating at that capacity level, 24.76 billion yuan in a single quarter. If you stacked that in 100 yuan notes, you would build a column taller than most commercial skyscrapers. The point is not the number itself. It is that a memory company most analysts in the West were filing under perennial loss center apparently generated it in 90 days. Micron, which once held a meaningful position in that same Chinese market, has faced a significantly more constrained operating environment there in recent years, as documented in its own public filings and widely covered by analysts. The domestic gap that created was, by design or by outcome, the space CXMT's subsidized capacity was being built to fill. Every year of losses was the below-cost build that made the revenue flip instant, the moment demand and policy clicked into place. Think of a restaurant that spends 3 years losing money on rent, equipment, and staff before it opens to the public. The losses are not evidence it cannot cook. They are the preparation. The first weekend of full service does not look like a surprise. It looks like the plan. Now the lock reads clearly. Export controls limited Micron's access to China's most sensitive procurement channels. Domestic preference policies tilted buyers toward local suppliers. Those restrictions did not just disadvantage a competitor. They sealed a space. And inside that sealed space, CXMT had been spending a decade building capacity that had nowhere else to go. The losses were not failure. They were the ante. I want to be careful here because both the bullish and bearish readings on CXMT are partly right, and collapsing one into the other is how you get the story wrong. The bullish case is real. The Starboard review passage is a genuine institutional signal. Chinese regulators do not wave through a listing candidate that looks like a liability. The reported profitability, if the quarter holds up to independent scrutiny, represents genuine operational momentum. At some meaningful scale, CXMT is actually making memory chips that domestic buyers want to purchase. But profit shaped by subsidy and procurement policy is not the same as profit shaped by competitive margin. If policy shifts, if domestic buyers gain access to better performing foreign DRAM again, or if the operating environment for Micron in China changes, the demand channel narrows. Analysts broadly report a node gap between CXMT and leading international producers, and physical limits on yield, heat management, and density at advanced geometries do not dissolve because a balance sheet looks good. One strong quarter financed by a captive market does not prove the captive market is permanent. The losses were the down payment. This quarter is the receipt. Whether the asset they purchased holds its value depends entirely on how durable the policy environment that created it turns out to be. That is the uncertainty one quarter cannot answer. So here's the better question. We started by asking how a decade of losses vanished in 90 days. But that question assumes the losses and the profit are opposites, that the 10 years of red ink was a problem the quarter finally solved. They are not opposites. They are two stages of the same transaction. The better question is, what was a decade of losses in a CXMT fabrication plant actually purchasing? It was purchasing the capacity to be the only supplier standing in a sealed domestic market when the demand arrived. The quarter did not erase the losses, it cashed them. My read is this. This is not a story about a scrappy underdog finding its footing after years of struggle. It is a deliberate industrial wager. Place enough subsidized capacity into a protected space, hold through a decade of red ink, and wait for external pressure on your competitor to shut the door you need shut. Whether that wager is wise over the long term depends on whether the door stays shut. And that is a policy question, not an engineering one. Policy questions do not appear on a balance sheet. That DRAM wafer that rolled off the line in early 2026 did not come from nowhere. It came from 10 years of fabs running below cost, building the muscle the quarter needed. The wafer did not know it was carrying a decade. The balance sheet noticed, read the lost decade backward, and the lock opens. It was sealed, so the inside could be built without competition. The access restrictions told you what Micron's position in that market was worth. The losses told you what CXMT was willing to spend to occupy it. The losses were not the wound. They were the wager. And the first quarter of 2026 was the payout slip. Here is what I am genuinely uncertain about. Is a profit this large, this fast, this concentrated in a single protected market evidence that CXMT can compete globally, or evidence that it does not need to? Drop your read below. And if this kind of unpacking is useful to you, subscribing keeps the next one in your feed.